She daily comes late to the office and leaves early. The CEO warned her and then fired her. She begged him in tears, but when he followed her, he found her feeding twin girls alone after work. Hi, my beautiful family. It's your Mr. Peter. Today, I just want to speak from the softest part of my heart. Thank you for 30,000 souls who chose to stand beside me. But even with that love, I feel a quiet ache. Views are dropping, watch time is falling, and I wonder, have I lost your heart or do you simply miss hearing mine? Please don't think I'm giving up, because I'm not. I'll return in 3 to 5 days to narrate again with my voice and my soul. I just need a moment to breathe, to feel you close again. And before I go, let me give you this, the only thing that never fails. I pray that peace rushes into every space inside you that aches in silence, that your fears begin to melt under the warmth of hope, that love, real love, returns to you in gentle ways, through people, memories and moments that remind you you're not forgotten. May your strength rise again like morning light, and may your heart rest knowing this. You are loved more than you know, and you are never walking alone. If you want me to come back, if you still believe in my voice, please like this video and comment. We want our Mr. Peter back. I promise you, I'm coming. And when I do, I'll come back with all my heart, with endless love. Always your Mr. Peter.
Some people believe that success is measured by the height of your office and the coldness of your heart. But Jay McCrary had never questioned this philosophy until he met the woman who whispered to flowers. The morning sun cast long shadows through the floor-to-ceiling windows of McCrary Industries' 42nd floor, where Jay McCrary stood like a king surveying his kingdom. At 28, he had built an empire that lesser men could only dream of, transforming a small family business into a multi-million-dollar corporation that dominated the city's skyline. His reflection in the glass showed a man carved from granite, and ambition, sharp jawline, piercing gray eyes, and an expensive suit that fit him like armor. But kingdoms required absolute order. Every employee, every process, every detail had to function with clockwork precision. There was no room for sentimentality, no tolerance for excuses, and certainly no patience for those who couldn't maintain his exacting standards. Which brought his attention to the woman currently kneeling beside the office plants. Jody Allen moved through the corporate landscape like a gentle breeze in a hurricane, her presence so soft it seemed almost accidental. While other employees rushed past the decorative plants with businesslike indifference, she paused at each one, her fingers trailing over leaves with maternal tenderness. Jay watched from his glass office as she bent down to the struggling ficus, her lips moving in what appeared to be a whispered conversation. "Talking to plants," he muttered to himself, shaking his head, "as if this company hasn't seen enough unprofessional behavior." His assistant, Margaret, appeared at his elbow with the punctuality of a Swiss watch. "Mr. McCrary, the Henderson report is ready for your review, and the board meeting has been moved to 2 o'clock. "Thank you, Margaret. And what's the situation with Allen?" Margaret's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. 23 minutes late this morning, sir. That makes it the 5th time in 2 weeks. Jay's jaw clenched. In his world, time was more valuable than gold, and every minute lost to tardiness was a minute stolen from productivity. He had built his reputation on precision, on the understanding that success demanded sacrifice from everyone, including himself. He arrived at the office at 6:30 every morning, left at 9 every evening, and had never missed a deadline in his entire career. "Send her up," he said, his voice carrying the weight of final judgment. 3 floors below, Jody Allen felt her heart skip as Margaret's call came through the intercom. The morning had started with chaos. Twin 3-year-olds who refused breakfast, a daycare that opened at 7 a.m. sharp, and a broken car that started on the 3rd try. She needed this job desperately. 8 months ago, her world had imploded when David simply vanished, leaving behind nothing but unpaid bills and two confused toddlers who still asked for their daddy every night. The salary from McCrary Industries was barely enough to cover rent, daycare, and groceries. But it was steady, and in her current situation, steady was everything. Now, climbing the stairs to the executive floor because she was too nervous to trust herself in the elevator, Jody clutched the small silver locket at her throat. The only photo she had of happier times, when her family was whole and the future had seemed bright with possibility. The executive floor was a temple to success, all polished marble and intimidating silence. Jody's worn flats made soft, squeaking sounds against the pristine floor as she approached Jay McCrary's office, her hands trembling slightly as she smoothed her skirt, the same skirt that bore a small grass stain from this morning's adventure in the building's courtyard, where she'd tried to collect a few dandelions for the twins' nature collection. Through the glass walls, she could see him, Jay McCrary, the man whose name graced the building, whose reputation for ruthless efficiency was legendary throughout the company. He sat behind his desk like a judge preparing to deliver a verdict, his expensive suit immaculate, his expression unreadable. "Come in," his voice carried through the intercom, and Jody's heart hammered against her ribs. The office was a study in masculine power, dark wood, leather chairs, and awards that gleamed like trophies from a successful hunt. Jay didn't look up immediately, his attention focused on the papers spread across his desk with the intensity of a general studying battle plans. "Miss Allen," he finally said, his voice carrying the chill of winter morning, "please, sit down." Jody perched on the edge of the leather chair, her hands folded in her lap to hide their shaking. Up close, Jay McCrary was even more intimidating. His presence filled the room like a storm cloud, all sharp angles and barely contained power. But there was something else, something she couldn't quite name, that flickered behind his steel gray eyes. "I'm sure you know why you're here," he continued, finally looking up to meet her gaze. "Your punctuality, or rather, your consistent lack thereof, has become a significant problem. Mr. McCrary, I can explain—" "Can you?" He leaned back in his chair, his expression unchanged. "Can you explain why, in the past 2 weeks alone, you've been late 5 times? Can you explain why your personal difficulties consistently interfere with your professional obligations?" Jody felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I'm doing my best, sir. I know I've been struggling with the schedule, but nothing." Jay's voice cut through her explanation like a blade. "This is a business, Ms. Allen, not a charity organization. We have deadlines, commitments, and expectations. When you're late, it affects everyone around you." What he didn't say, what he couldn't say, was that her tardiness bothered him for reasons he couldn't quite articulate. There was something about Jody Allen that unsettled his carefully ordered world. The way she moved through the office with such gentleness, the way she treated the plants like living things deserving of care, the way she smiled at the security guard every morning, despite her obvious stress. It all felt like a crack in the armor of his perfectly controlled environment. "I understand, Mr. McCrary," Jody said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know I've been disappointing you. It's just that my daughters—" "Your personal life is not my concern," Jay interrupted, but even as he said it, something twisted uncomfortably in his chest. "What concerns me is performance, reliability, and professionalism, qualities that you've consistently failed to demonstrate." Jody's hand moved instinctively to the locket at her throat, her fingers tracing the worn silver surface. Inside was a photo of better times, herself, David, and the twins when they were barely walking, all of them laughing at some long-forgotten joke. Before the abandonment, before the sleepless nights and the constant worry about money, before she'd learned that love wasn't always enough to keep a family together. "I'm trying, Mr. McCrary," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "I know I'm not perfect, but I'm trying so hard." For a moment, something flickered across Jay's face, a shadow of uncertainty, perhaps even sympathy. But it was gone so quickly that Jody wondered if she'd imagined it. "Trying isn't enough," he said finally, his voice returning to its previous coldness. "This is your final warning, Ms. Allen. One more instance of tardiness, and your employment with McCrary Industries will be terminated. Do I make myself clear?" Jody nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady. She stood on shaking legs, smoothing her skirt once more, and turned toward the door. "Ms. Allen," Jay's voice stopped her at the threshold. She turned back, hope flickering in her eyes. "Don't let me down." As she left his office, Jay remained seated at his desk, staring at the space where she'd been. Something about her desperation, her quiet dignity despite his harsh words, had stirred something in his chest that he'd thought long buried. He shook his head, dismissing the feeling as momentary weakness. But as he watched her walk away through the glass walls, her shoulders squared despite her obvious distress, he couldn't shake the image of her kneeling beside the office plants, whispering to them like trusted confidants who understood her secrets. What he didn't know was that tomorrow would bring a storm that would change everything, and that the woman who whispered to flowers would soon teach him the difference between success and happiness, between control and compassion, between the man he was and the man he was meant to become. Chapter 2. When Thunder Meets Lightning. The storm arrived without warning, like heartbreak on a Tuesday morning, bringing the kind of reckoning that changes everything in a single heartbeat. Dark clouds had gathered over the city since dawn, casting shadows through McCrary Industries' windows and filling the air with electric tension. Jay McCrary stood in his office, watching the sky darken, his mood matching the ominous weather. 3 days had passed since his final warning to Jody Allen, and this morning, when the Henderson Industries executives were arriving for the quarter's most important presentation, she was nowhere to be found. 27 minutes past 9, and her desk remained empty. "Margaret," Jay's voice carried the sharp edge of barely controlled fury as he pressed the intercom button. "Where is Allen?" "I haven't seen her yet, Mr. McCrary," came the careful reply. "Shall I try calling her?" Jay's jaw tightened as he stared out at the storm clouds. The Henderson deal was worth $12 million, and every detail of this morning's presentation had been planned with military precision. The conference room was prepared, the catering arranged, and the presentation materials meticulously organized. Everything was perfect except for one glaring absence. "Don't bother," he said, his voice cold as winter steel. "Send word to HR. We'll be having a termination meeting as soon as Ms. Allen decides to grace us with her presence." What Jay didn't know was that Jody Allen was sitting in her broken-down car 3 blocks away, her forehead pressed against the steering wheel as tears of frustration streamed down her face. The car had died completely, not just the reluctant starting of recent mornings, but total mechanical failure. The mechanic had warned her last week that the engine was living on borrowed time, but she'd hoped it would last just a little longer. Last night had been a nightmare. Monica had spiked a fever that reached 102 degrees, and Jody had spent the dark hours applying cool cloths and whispering prayers while Tina slept fitfully on the couch. By 7, Monica's fever had broken, but Tina had woken up with the same telltale flush of illness. 2 sick toddlers, a dead car, and a job she couldn't afford to lose. It felt like the universe was conspiring against her. The taxi ride to work had eaten up her lunch money for the rest of the week, and she'd arrived knowing she was walking into disaster. But she'd hoped that Mr. McCrary might understand, that the man who'd shown that brief flicker of something softer might find it in his heart to give her one more chance. Those hopes died the moment she stepped off the elevator and saw Margaret's expression. "Miss Allen," Margaret said, her voice carrying the weight of an execution announcement. "Mr. McCrary needs to see you immediately. Conference Room B. The walk to Conference Room B felt like walking to her own funeral. Jodi's legs trembled with each step, her heart pounding so hard she was certain everyone could hear it. Through the glass walls, she could see Jay pacing like a caged lion, his expression thunderous. The presentation materials were spread across the conference table like evidence in a criminal trial, and she realized with sinking horror that this was about more than just her tardiness. The Henderson presentation, the most important meeting of the quarter, and she was supposed to have prepared the final binding for the documents. "Come in." Jay's voice cut through the glass like a blade, and Jodi stepped into what felt like the center of a storm. The conference room was a temple to corporate power, mahogany table, leather chairs, and a view that spoke of success and achievement. Jay stood at the head of the table, his expensive suit immaculate despite the early hour, his piercing gray eyes fixed on her with the intensity of a judge delivering a verdict. "Miss Allen," he began, his voice carrying cold finality, "do you have any idea what time it is?" "I'm sorry, Mr. McCrary," Jodi whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of her own heartbeat. "I know I'm late, but if you could just let me explain." "Explain?" Jay's laugh was sharp and bitter. "You want to explain why you've missed the most important presentation of the quarter? You want to explain why the Henderson executives are arriving in 30 minutes to find their documents incomplete because you couldn't be bothered to show up?" Jodi felt the blood drain from her face. "The binding, oh God, I forgot about the binding. Mr. McCrary, please, I can fix this. I can—" "No!" The word fell between them like a guillotine blade. "No, you can't fix this. Do you have any idea what this deal means to this company? $12 million, Miss Allen. $12 million and the professional reputation of everyone in this building." Thunder rumbled overhead, and the first drops of rain began to streak the windows. Jay moved to stand directly in front of her, his presence overwhelming in the confined space of the conference room. "I gave you every opportunity," he continued, his voice growing colder with each word. "I gave you warnings, chances, and more patience than I've ever shown any employee. And this is how you repay that consideration? By sabotaging the most important presentation of the year?" "I didn't sabotage anything," Jodi said, her voice breaking. "My daughters were sick, and my car broke down, and Your daughters?" Jay's voice carried a mixture of contempt and disbelief. "Always your daughters. Always some excuse about your personal life interfering with your professional obligations. Let me make something perfectly clear, Ms. Allen. This is a business, not a daycare center." The words hit Jodi like physical blows. She thought of Tina and Monica, still feverish and confused, asking for their mama as she'd left them with the neighbor. She thought of the bills piling up on her kitchen counter, the empty refrigerator, the notice from the landlord that was already 3 days overdue. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "please don't do this. I need this job. I know I've made mistakes, but I'm trying so hard. I just need one more chance." "One more chance?" Jay's laugh was harsh and bitter. "I've given you nothing but chances. What you need is a reality check about responsibility and priorities." Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the conference room in stark, dramatic relief. In that moment, Jodi saw something flicker across Jay's face, a shadow of doubt, perhaps even regret. But it was gone so quickly she wondered if she'd imagined it. "Your employment with McCrary Industries is terminated, effective immediately," Jay said, his voice carrying the finality of a death sentence. "Security will escort you to collect your personal belongings." The folder in Jodi's hands slipped from her trembling fingers, sending papers scattering across the polished conference table like fallen leaves. The sound seemed to echo in the sudden silence, broken only by the increasing intensity of the storm outside. "No," she breathed, the word barely a whisper. No, please, Mr. McCrary, I'm begging you. I have two little girls who depend on me. I don't have anywhere else to go. Something twisted in Jay's chest at the desperation in her voice, but he forced himself to remain unmoved. Success required hard decisions, and he'd built his empire on the foundation of unwavering discipline. "That's not my problem," he said, though the words tasted like ash in his mouth. Jodi's legs gave out, and she sank to her knees on the cold marble floor. The tears she'd been holding back for weeks finally broke free in a torrent of grief and terror. "Please," she sobbed, her hands pressed against the floor as if she could somehow anchor herself to this life she was losing. "Please don't take this away from me. I have nothing else. They have nothing else." Jay stood frozen, watching this woman, this strong, gentle woman who whispered to plants and smiled at security guards, completely broken before him. Her tears fell like rain on the pristine floor, each drop a testament to his own cruelty. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking on every word. "I'm so sorry for disappointing you. I'm sorry for being late, for being a burden, for not being strong enough. But please, I'm begging you, don't take away the only thing standing between my daughters and—" "Enough!" Jay's voice cut through her plea like a blade. "This decision is final. Security will be here in 5 minutes." He turned away from her, his hands clasped behind his back as he stared out at the storm. The thunder was growing louder now, and the rain was beginning to fall in earnest, streaming down the windows like tears from heaven. Behind him, Jodi slowly pulled herself to her feet, her movements mechanical and defeated. She bent to gather the scattered papers, her hands shaking so badly she could barely grasp them. The sound of her quiet crying filled the room, mixing with the thunder outside. "I hope you can live with yourself," she whispered as she reached the door. "I hope you can sleep at night knowing what you've done." Jay didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge her words, but they hit him like physical blows. He remained standing at the window, his reflection ghost-like in the storm-darkened glass, until the sound of her footsteps faded away. Only then did he allow himself to close his eyes, to feel the weight of what he'd done. But it was too late. The storm had already begun, and some things, once broken, could never be put back together. Chapter 3. The Secret Garden of Her Heart. Guilt has a way of following you home, slipping into the spaces between your ribs and settling there like a persistent ache that no amount of success can soothe. The Henderson presentation had been salvaged by Margaret's efficiency and Jay's damage control. The executives had noticed the missing materials and rushed explanations, but they'd still signed the contract. $12 million was too much to walk away from. However, Jay had seen doubt in their eyes, whispered conversations about whether McCrary Industries was losing its edge. Now, as evening painted the city in shades of amber and shadow, Jay sat in his penthouse office, surrounded by the trophies of his success. Awards lined the walls, certificates hung in perfect rows, and through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city sprawled beneath him like a conquered kingdom. But none of it could quiet the memory of Jodi Allen on her knees, begging for mercy he'd refused to give. "Damn it," he muttered, pushing away from his desk with enough force to send his expensive leather chair spinning. The sound of her voice echoed in his mind like a ghost that refused to be exorcised. "I have two little girls who depend on me. I don't have anywhere else to go." He'd built his empire on the foundation of unwavering discipline, on the understanding that success required sacrifice from everyone, including himself. Emotions were weaknesses to be controlled, sentiment a luxury he couldn't afford. Every decision had to be made with cold, calculating logic, and Jodi Allen had been a liability he couldn't continue to carry. So why did he feel like he'd just committed murder? The storm had passed, leaving the city washed clean and gleaming under the evening lights. Jay found himself standing at the window, his reflection a ghostly figure against the darkening sky. Somewhere out there, Jody was probably trying to figure out how to explain to her daughters why Mommy had lost her job, why the bills wouldn't get paid, why their world had just crumbled around them. Two little girls who depend on me. The words wouldn't leave him alone. He'd never thought about her personal life beyond how it affected her work performance. In his world, employees were resources to be managed, problems to be solved, efficiency ratings to be optimized. The idea that they had lives outside the office, families that depended on them, dreams that extended beyond quarterly reports. It was an abstraction he'd never allowed himself to consider. But now, alone in his palace of glass and steel, Jay couldn't stop thinking about the desperation in Jody's voice, the way she'd clutched that silver locket at her throat like a lifeline, the quiet dignity with which she'd tried to explain the unexplainable. Without really making a conscious decision, Jay found himself in the elevator, then in his car, then driving through the city streets as if pulled by some invisible force. He told himself he was just going for a drive, that he needed to clear his head after the stress of the day. Jay's hands seemed to have a mind of their own, turning the steering wheel toward the address he'd memorized from her employment file. The neighborhood was a world away from his penthouse luxury, modest apartments with small balconies, children's bicycles chained to railings, and community gardens that spoke of people making the best of what they had. Jay parked his expensive car at the end of the street, suddenly self-conscious about how it gleamed like a beacon of wealth in this humble setting. He walked slowly, his footsteps echoing against the quiet residential streets. The address led him to a small apartment complex, 3 stories of worn brick and painted window frames that had seen better days but still maintained an air of dignity. The building was old but clean, with flower boxes under some of the windows and a small garden area behind a chain-link fence. And there, in that garden, Jay found her. Jody was kneeling between rows of tomato plants, her work clothes replaced by faded jeans and a soft sweater the color of autumn leaves. But she wasn't alone. 2 identical little girls, maybe 3 years old, sat beside her in the dirt, their small hands carefully patting soil around tiny seedlings under their mother's gentle guidance. Jay's breath caught in his throat. The twins were beautiful, curly brown hair that caught the last rays of sunlight, bright eyes that sparkled with curiosity, and the kind of innocent joy that seemed to radiate from their very being. "Gentle hands, Tina," Jody was saying, her voice carrying the patient love of a mother who'd repeated the same instruction 1,000 times. "The little plants need us to be careful with them." "Like this, Mama?" the little girl asked, her tongue poking out in concentration as she tried to copy her mother's movements. "Perfect, sweetheart. And Monica, see how we give them just a little water. Not too much, or they'll get sick." Jay watched, transfixed, as Jody demonstrated the proper way to water the seedlings. Her movements were sure and confident here, in stark contrast to the nervous woman who'd trembled in his office. This was her element, her sanctuary, where she could be the expert teaching her children about life and growth, and the patience required to nurture something beautiful. "Mama, sing the growing song," Monica requested, clapping her dirt-covered hands together. Jody's laugh was like music, warm and genuine and completely different from the strained politeness she'd shown at the office. "The growing song? But we just sang it yesterday." "Please, Mama, the plants like it," Tina added, her eyes bright with conviction. "Oh, well, if the plants like it," Jody said, her voice filled with the kind of love that made Jay's chest ache with an unfamiliar longing. "But only if you help me." She began to sing in a voice that was surprisingly lovely, soft and melodic, like a lullaby made for garden afternoons. The words were simple, something about sunshine and rain and the magic of growing things. But there was something achingly beautiful about watching her sing to her daughters while her hands worked the soil. The twins joined in with their high, sweet voices, stumbling over some of the words, but singing with such enthusiasm that Jay found himself smiling despite everything. This was what he'd taken from them, not just a job, but the security that allowed for moments like this, the peace of mind that let a mother sing silly songs with her children without worrying about tomorrow. "Why did Daddy leave us, Mama?" Monica asked suddenly, her small voice cutting through the evening air. Jody's singing stopped abruptly, and Jay watched her face crumple for just a moment before she composed herself. She set down her watering can and pulled both girls into her arms, holding them close. "I don't know, baby," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. "Sometimes grown-ups make choices that don't make sense. But I want you to know that it wasn't because of anything you did, okay? You two are perfect and beautiful and the best things that ever happened to me." "Are you going to leave us too?" Tina asked, her voice so small it was barely audible. "Never," Jody said fiercely, pressing kisses to the tops of their heads. "I will never, ever leave you. Not for anything in the whole world. We're going to be okay, I promise. Mama's going to find a way to take care of us." Jay felt something break inside his chest. He'd been so focused on her professional shortcomings that he'd never stopped to consider the weight she was carrying. She wasn't just an employee who couldn't manage her time. She was a woman abandoned by the man who'd promised to love her forever, left to raise two small children alone while battling her own grief and terror. "I'm scared, Mama," Monica whispered. "I know, sweetheart, I'm scared too sometimes. But you know what? We have each other, and we have our garden, and we have love. And love is the strongest thing in the whole world. It's stronger than scary things, stronger than sad things, stronger than anything that tries to hurt us." The twins seemed to accept this wisdom with the faith that only children possess. They snuggled closer to their mother, their earlier worry forgotten in the security of her embrace. "Can we stay out here a little longer?" Tina asked. "The flowers aren't done talking to us yet." Jody laughed, and Jay could hear the tears she was fighting back. "Of course we can, baby. But then we need to go inside for dinner and baths and story time." "Will you tell us about the princess who could talk to animals?" Monica asked hopefully. "I think I can manage that," Jody said, settling more comfortably on the ground as the twins curled up against her sides like puppies seeking warmth. Jay watched them for another few minutes, this little family that had found ways to create joy despite their circumstances. Jody's voice rose and fell as she told some elaborate story about a princess and her animal friends, complete with different voices for each character. The twins giggled and asked questions and interrupted with their own additions to the tale. This was what he'd tried to destroy with his cold efficiency and unforgiving standards. This was what his $12 million presentation had cost. Not just Jody's job, but the security of two innocent children who'd already lost their father and now faced the terrifying prospect of losing their home, their stability, their mother's ability to provide for them. As the sun set completely and the garden was bathed in the soft glow of the apartment building's outdoor lights, Jay finally turned away. He walked back to his car in silence, his mind reeling with the weight of what he'd witnessed. Back in his penthouse, surrounded by the cold symbols of his success, Jay couldn't shake the image of Jody in the garden, singing to her daughters while teaching them about growth and patience and the magic of nurturing something beautiful. He'd spent his entire adult life building an empire, accumulating wealth and power and influence, but he'd never created anything as precious as the love he'd seen in that small garden. For the first time in his life, Jay McCrary wondered if he'd been measuring success by the wrong standards. And for the first time since he'd fired Jody Allen, he began to understand the true magnitude of what he'd done. The woman who whispered to flowers wasn't weak or unprofessional. She was a warrior fighting battles he couldn't even imagine, and she'd been fighting them alone. The question now was whether it was too late to make things right, or if some wounds were too deep to heal. But as he sat in his empty office, staring out at the city lights, Jay made a decision that would change everything. He couldn't undo what he'd done, but maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to help them without her ever knowing it was him. Chapter 4. The Guardian Angel's Dilemma. Sometimes redemption begins with a grocery bag left on a doorstep at dawn, and sometimes the hardest person to forgive is the one staring back at you from the mirror. Jay McCrary had never been a man who questioned his decisions, but for the past 3 days, sleep had become a stranger and peace of mind a distant memory. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Jody kneeling in that garden with her daughters, creating magic from dirt and seeds while singing away their fears. Every quiet moment in his office was filled with the echo of Monica's small voice, asking why their daddy had left them, and Tina's whispered worry about whether Mama would leave them too. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd fired her for the very strength he now admired. Her lateness hadn't been carelessness, it had been the desperate juggling of a woman trying to be everything to everyone while her world fell apart around her. Those missed minutes at the office represented stolen moments with sick children, broken-down cars, and the 1,000 tiny crises that came with single parenthood. He'd spent 48 hours researching her situation with the same methodical thoroughness he applied to business acquisitions. David Allen had been a construction worker, married to Jody for 4 years before he simply vanished 8 months ago. No divorce papers filed, no legal separation, just a man who walked out one morning and never came back. The bank records Jay's private investigator had accessed showed David had emptied their joint savings account the day he left. $2,847 that had been meant for the twins' college funds. What followed was a devastating cascade of financial ruin. Unpaid medical bills from the twins' birth complications, overdue rent notices, utility disconnection warnings, and the slow, steady slide toward eviction that Jody had been fighting with nothing but her McCrary Industries salary and sheer determination. And now she didn't even have that. The first delivery had taken Jay 20 minutes to orchestrate and a lifetime of courage to execute. He'd filled a cart with everything a family with small children might need: fresh produce, organic milk, whole grain bread, and enough non-perishables to last weeks. He'd added children's vitamins and all the small necessities that stretched tight budgets beyond their limits. The delivery service was simple, a courier company specializing in anonymous gifts. The card was deliberately vague. For the little gardeners and their beautiful mama, someone believes in your strength. Jay had positioned himself across the street in his car at 7:30, watching Jody's apartment building with the intensity of a man waiting for a verdict on his own soul. When she emerged for what he assumed was another job interview, she was dressed in her best clothes, though he could see the careful mending on her skirt and worn spots on her shoes. She nearly tripped over the bags waiting by her door. Through his telephoto lens, Jay watched her face cycle through confusion, suspicion, and finally, overwhelming relief. She'd sat down right there on her doorstep, surrounded by groceries, and cried with the kind of desperate gratitude that made Jay's chest ache with remorse. The twins had emerged moments later, still in their pajamas, and their delighted squeals over the fresh strawberries had carried across the quiet morning air. That was the beginning. Over the next week, Jay became a student of their lives, learning their routines with the dedication of a man trying to atone for unforgivable sins. He discovered that Jody walked the twins to neighborhood daycare every morning at 7:15, her old car having finally died completely. The walk was nearly 2 miles each way, which meant she was spending 4 hours daily just getting her daughters to and from childcare. He learned that she'd taken a job at a local diner, working breakfast and lunch shifts for minimum wage plus tips. She picked up the twins at 4, brought them home for dinner and playtime, then worked until midnight doing freelance data entry on an ancient laptop. The packages began appearing with clockwork regularity. Children's clothes in exact sizes, delivered with tags reading, "Every princess deserves to sparkle." Educational toys that would help with development, accompanied by notes saying, "For growing minds and curious hearts." Art supplies, books, puzzles, everything carefully chosen to enrich their lives. Jay researched child development with the same intensity he'd once applied to hostile takeovers. He learned about the importance of routine for children who'd experienced trauma, about how financial stress could impact a parent's ability to provide emotional stability. The knowledge made his actions feel both more necessary and more inadequate. How could a few anonymous gifts begin to heal the damage that David's abandonment had caused? How could groceries and toys address the fundamental insecurity that haunted Jodi's days and invaded her dreams? But the gifts seemed to help, at least a little. Jay watched from his carefully maintained distance as Jodi's posture gradually straightened, as the constant worry lines around her eyes began to ease slightly. The twins were thriving. He could see them growing stronger and more confident during their daily walks to daycare, their laughter ringing out more frequently as they played in the small garden behind their building. The most meaningful delivery had been the third one, a care package that included not just necessities, but small luxuries. Good coffee for Jodi, whose exhaustion was written in every line of her face. Bath bombs that would help her relax during the few precious minutes she had to herself. A bottle of the lavender lotion he'd seen her admiring in the pharmacy, where she filled the twins' prescriptions, but never bought anything for herself. The note with that package had been different, more personal. "Self-care isn't selfish. You deserve kindness, especially from yourself." Jay had watched her read that note 3 times, sitting on her apartment steps while the twins played with the new sidewalk chalk he'd included. She'd pressed the paper to her chest and closed her eyes, and for a moment he'd seen some of the weight lift from her shoulders. But it wasn't enough. It would never be enough to truly make up for what he'd done to her, to them. The anonymous gifts were band-aids on a wound that required surgery, temporary relief for a problem that demanded permanent solutions. The breaking point came during week 2 of his guardian angel routine. Jay had been watching Jodi serve coffee to truckers and construction workers with the same gentle grace she'd shown the office plants. She looked exhausted in a way sleep couldn't fix. An older man at the counter was giving her trouble, complaining loudly about everything from his coffee temperature to service speed. Jay watched Jodi's shoulders tense, watched her hands tremble as she refilled the man's cup for the 3rd time, watched her bite back whatever response she wanted to give because she couldn't afford to lose this job too. "Listen here, sweetheart," the man was saying, loud enough for Jay to hear through the diner's open windows. "I don't know what your problem is, but when I order eggs over easy, I mean over easy, not this rubber garbage you keep bringing me." "I'm so sorry, sir," Jodi replied, her voice steady despite the humiliation. "Let me get you a fresh plate right away." "You better, and this time try to remember that some of us have real jobs to get to. We can't all afford to waste time standing around looking pretty." Jay's hands clenched into fists as he watched Jodi's face flush with embarrassment. She'd endured enough, from David's abandonment, from his own cruelty, from a world that seemed determined to punish her for the crime of being vulnerable. Watching her suffer through yet another humiliation while she tried desperately to support her children was more than he could bear. That night, he made a decision that would change everything. The next morning brought the largest delivery yet, a week's worth of groceries, new clothes for all 3 of them, educational materials for the twins, and an envelope containing enough cash to cover their rent for 2 months. But this time, Jay included something different, a simple business card for a reputable employment agency, along with a note that read, "You have skills and talents that the right employer will value. You deserve better than survival. You deserve success. He'd also made some calls, using his influence to ensure that when Jody contacted the agency, she'd find opportunities that matched her abilities and her needs. Nothing that could be traced back to him, but enough to give her a real chance at rebuilding her life. As he watched her discover the latest delivery, Jay felt something he hadn't experienced in years: hope. Not for himself, but for her. For the woman who sang to flowers and created magic from nothing, who faced each day with courage he was only beginning to understand. The twins were growing stronger under the consistent nutrition the groceries provided. Jody was sleeping a little better, the constant panic in her eyes gradually replaced by cautious optimism. The anonymous gifts were making a difference, but Jay knew they were just the beginning. He couldn't undo his cruelty, couldn't take back the harsh words or erase the humiliation he'd caused her. But maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to help her build something better, something that would give her children the security they deserved and give her the recognition her strength had earned. The guardian angel routine was working, but Jay was beginning to realize that what Jody really needed wasn't charity. She needed justice. She needed the world to see what he'd finally learned to see: that she wasn't weak or unreliable, she was extraordinary. And perhaps if he was very careful and very lucky, he might find a way to give her that recognition without destroying the fragile progress they'd all made. The woman who whispered to flowers deserved to have the whole world listen. Jay was determined to make sure they did. Chapter 5. Coffee, Cookies, and Innocent Hearts. Courage, Jay McCrary discovered, could be found in the most unlikely places, like a bouquet of sunflowers purchased from a street vendor and the terrifying prospect of knocking on a door you had no right to approach. 3 weeks had passed since he'd become Jody's anonymous benefactor, 3 weeks of watching from afar as his carefully orchestrated gifts helped ease the worst of her financial distress. The employment agency had done their job perfectly. Jody now had interviews lined up with 3 different companies, all of whom had been subtly encouraged to value her unique combination of skills, reliability, and grace under pressure. Jay had made sure of that through carefully placed recommendations that couldn't be traced back to him. But watching from a distance was no longer enough. The more he learned about Jody and her daughters, the more he found himself thinking about them during board meetings, during business dinners, during the long, empty hours in his penthouse when success felt more like a prison than an achievement. He wanted to know them, really know them, not just observe them through telephoto lenses and surveillance reports, which was how he found himself standing on the sidewalk outside Jody's apartment building on a Saturday morning, clutching a bouquet of sunflowers and feeling more nervous than he had before his first $1 million presentation. The building looked different in daylight, smaller, more worn around the edges, but somehow more real than the glass and steel monuments to ambition that filled his usual world. Children's voices drifted from the small playground behind the building, mixing with the sound of someone playing guitar on a nearby balcony. It was the kind of community he'd never experienced, where neighbors knew each other's names and shared babysitting duties and borrowed cups of sugar. Jay had practiced his excuse during the drive over. He was checking on a former employee, ensuring she'd landed on her feet after the unfortunate necessity of her termination. It was thin, transparent even to him, but it was the only explanation he could think of that didn't involve confessing to 3 weeks of elaborate stalking. The front door of the building opened before he could talk himself out of ringing the buzzer, and an elderly woman emerged carrying a bag of groceries that looked too heavy for her small frame. "Oh, let me help you with that," Jay said automatically, reaching for the bag. The woman looked surprised but grateful. "Why, thank you, young man. That's very kind. I'm Mrs. Rodriguez from 2B. Are you here to see someone?" "Jody Allen," Jay replied, suddenly aware of how out of place he must look in his expensive, casual clothes and perfectly styled hair. "I'm a friend." Mrs. Rodriguez's face lit up with genuine warmth. "Oh, Jody. Such a sweet girl, and those precious babies of hers. She's been so much happier lately. I think those mystery packages have been a godsend. Someone's been very generous to that family." Jay felt heat rise in his cheeks. Mystery packages. Someone's been leaving gifts for them. Groceries, clothes for the girls, toys. Anonymous deliveries, can you imagine? It's restored my faith in humanity, knowing there are still people out there who help others without wanting credit. Jody deserves every kindness after what that no-good husband of hers put her through. The elevator was broken, Mrs. Rodriguez explained as she led Jay toward the stairs, so he'd have to walk up to the third floor. Jay didn't mind. It gave him time to compose himself, to prepare for seeing Jody again after weeks of watching her from afar. Apartment 3C had a cheerful welcome mat and a small wind chime that tinkled softly in the hallway breeze. Before Jay could lose his nerve, he knocked. The door opened after a moment, revealing Jody Allen in a way he'd never seen her before. Gone was the nervous, professional woman from the office. In her place stood someone completely at ease in her own element. She wore faded jeans and a soft yellow sweater that brought out the gold flecks in her brown eyes. Her hair pulled back in a casual ponytail that somehow made her look both younger and more beautiful than he remembered. "Mr. McCrary?" The surprise in her voice was complete, followed quickly by wariness. "What are you doing here?" Before Jay could answer, two small voices piped up from behind her legs. "Mama, who is it?" came the first question, followed immediately by, "Is he the flower man?" from the second voice. Jay looked down to see two identical faces peeking out from behind Jody's legs, Tina and Monica, even more beautiful up close than they'd appeared from his distant observations. They had their mother's warm brown eyes and curly hair, but where Jody looked cautious, they looked curious. "These are my daughters," Jody said, her voice carefully neutral. "Tina and Monica. Girls, this is Mr. McCrary." "Hi," Monica said with the fearless friendliness of a 3-year-old, while Tina hung back shyly behind her sister. "I brought flowers," Jay said awkwardly, extending the sunflowers toward Jody. "I wanted to check on you, to see how you were doing after everything." Jody stared at the flowers for a long moment, and Jay could see the internal debate playing out across her face. Finally, she stepped back from the door. "Would you like to come in? I just made coffee, and the girls were about to have their afternoon snack." The apartment was exactly what Jay had expected, yet nothing like he'd imagined. It was tiny, but every inch radiated love and careful attention. Children's artwork covered the refrigerator, a small dining table doubled as an art station, and toys were scattered in the organized chaos natural to any home with young children. What struck Jay most was the overwhelming sense of warmth. Despite its modest size, it felt like a home in ways his penthouse never had. There was life here, laughter in the walls, love expressed in every carefully arranged detail. "Please sit down," Jody said, gesturing toward the sofa. "I'll put these in water. They're beautiful, thank you." Jay perched on the edge of the couch, feeling enormous and out of place. The twins had retreated to their toy box, but kept stealing glances at him with undisguised fascination. "Cookie," Monica announced suddenly, toddling over with a plate that held what appeared to be homemade chocolate chip cookies. "Mama made cookies." "That's very nice of you," Jay said, accepting a cookie that was slightly lopsided but smelled incredible. "Did you help your mama make these?" Monica nodded enthusiastically. "I stirred. Tina put in the chocolate chips." "They look delicious," Jay said, taking a bite. The cookie was perfect, warm and chewy with just the right balance of sweetness. "Wow, this is amazing." "Mama's the best cooker in the whole world," Tina announced, finally emerging from behind the toy box. "She makes pancakes that look like animals and soup that tastes like hugs." Jody returned from the kitchen carrying a tray with coffee mugs and a plate of cookies for the adults. Jay noticed that her hands were trembling slightly, and he realized how difficult this must be for her, having the man who'd fired her sitting in her living room, sharing coffee and cookies as if they were old friends. "Thank you," he said as she handed him a mug. The coffee was rich and perfectly brewed, served in a chipped ceramic mug that bore the words "World's Greatest Mom" in fading letters. "You said you wanted to check on us," Jody said, settling into the chair across from him. "May I ask why?" Jay took a sip of coffee, buying himself time to formulate an answer that wasn't a complete lie. "I've been thinking about the way I handled your termination. It was harsher than it needed to be. I wanted to make sure you and your daughters were okay." "We're fine," Jody said quickly, though Jay could hear the defensive edge in her voice. "I've been managing. The girls are healthy and happy, and I have some promising job interviews lined up." "I'm glad to hear that," Jay said, and meant it. "You deserve to find an employer who values what you bring to the table." Monica had been watching this exchange with the unself-conscious attention of a child, and now she climbed onto the couch beside Jay with the confidence of someone who'd never met a stranger. "Up," she demanded, raising her arms toward him. "Monica, no," Jody said quickly. "Mr. McCrary is a guest. You can't—" "It's fine," Jay interrupted, surprised by how much he wanted to hold the little girl. "Really, it's okay." Monica settled onto his lap with the easy trust of childhood, and Jay felt something shift in his chest. She was warm and solid and smelled like cookies and sunshine, and when she looked up at him with those bright, curious eyes, he understood for the first time why people talked about their hearts melting. "You're really tall," Monica observed seriously. "Are you a giant?" "I'm just a regular person," Jay said, charmed despite himself. "But you're right, I am pretty tall." "Tina's scared of tall people," Monica confided in a stage whisper. "But I told her you have nice eyes, so it's okay." Jay looked over at Tina, who was still hovering near the toy box, but watching him with growing interest. "What do you think, Tina? Are my eyes nice enough to make up for being tall?" Tina giggled and nodded shyly. "They're like the sky when it's not raining." The innocence of the comment hit Jay like a physical blow. When was the last time someone had seen anything good in him without considering his wealth or power or influence? When was the last time he'd been judged purely on the kindness in his eyes rather than the coldness of his business decisions? "That's a beautiful thing to say," he told her softly. "Thank you." For the next hour, Jay found himself drawn into the warm chaos of their afternoon routine. The twins showed him their artwork, their favorite books, their collection of smooth stones from the building's garden. Monica insisted on demonstrating her somersault technique, while Tina shyly shared a story about a princess who could talk to butterflies. Jody watched it all with growing amazement. This man, this powerful, intimidating CEO who'd fired her with such cold efficiency, was sitting on her second-hand sofa, listening to her daughter's chatter with genuine interest and patience. "You're different," she said, during a moment when the twins were distracted with their toys. "Than I expected, I mean. At the office, you seemed so cold, ruthless, completely lacking in human empathy," Jay suggested with a rueful smile. "I was going to say focused," Jody replied diplomatically, though they both knew his description was more accurate. "I am focused," Jay said quietly, watching Monica carefully arrange her toy horses in a line. "Maybe too focused. I've spent so many years building my business that I forgot there were other things worth building." Their eyes met across the small space, and for a moment something passed between them. Understanding, perhaps, or the beginning of it. Jay saw the woman who created magic from nothing, who sang away her children's fears and turned a tiny apartment into a palace of love. And Jody saw something in his expression that she hadn't expected: vulnerability, regret, and a loneliness that money couldn't cure. "Would you like to stay for dinner?" she heard herself asking. It's nothing fancy, just spaghetti and garlic bread. But there's plenty. Jay's smile was soft and genuine, transforming his entire face. I'd like that very much. As the afternoon melted into evening, as the twins gradually accepted him into their small circle of trust, Jay began to understand what he'd been missing in his relentless pursuit of success. It wasn't just about building an empire or accumulating wealth. It was about building connections, creating something that mattered beyond quarterly reports and profit margins. And maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to learn how to build something beautiful. Chapter 6. Sundays, Swings, and Stolen Glances. Magic, Jay McCrary learned, could be found in the most ordinary moments, like pushing twin toddlers on park swings while their mother watched, with eyes that held more warmth than he'd ever seen directed at him before. The dinner invitation had been the beginning of something neither of them had expected. What started as a single evening of spaghetti and shy conversations had somehow evolved into a tradition that now defined Jay's week more than any business meeting or corporate milestone. Every Sunday, without fail, he found himself standing outside Jody's apartment building with fresh pastries from the French bakery across town and a heart that beat faster with anticipation than it ever had for merger announcements. This particular Sunday morning arrived painted in shades of gold and amber, autumn settling over the city like a gentle blanket. Jay stood in the familiar spot by Jody's door, balancing a box of croissants and Danish pastries with coffee that he'd learned to prepare exactly the way she liked it, light cream, no sugar, with just a hint of cinnamon. JJ. Monica's voice rang out the moment Jody opened the door, followed immediately by the sound of small feet running across hardwood floors. The nickname had appeared during his third visit, born from Monica's enthusiastic but imperfect pronunciation of his name. Jay had expected to correct it, but something about the pure joy in her voice when she called for JJ made the formal distance of Mr. McCrary seem cold and unnecessary. "Good morning, sunshine," Jay said as Monica launched herself into his arms with the fearless trust that still amazed him. "Did you sleep well?" "I dreamed about flying horses," Monica announced seriously, "and they were purple with sparkly wings, and they let me ride one to the cloud castle where the Cookie Princess lives." "That sounds like an excellent dream," Jay replied, settling her on his hip as Tina appeared in the doorway, still rubbing sleep from her eyes but smiling at the sight of him. "Morning, JJ," Tina said softly, reaching up for her own hug. "Mama said you might take us to the park today." "If that's what you'd like to do," Jay said, looking over their heads to where Jody stood in the doorway, her hair still tousled from sleep, and her face soft with the kind of morning peace he'd rarely seen on anyone. She wore a simple sundress the color of autumn leaves, nothing expensive or particularly fashionable, but it made her look like she'd stepped out of a painting. The past month of regular meals and reduced financial stress had brought color back to her cheeks and erased some of the worry lines that had become permanent fixtures around her eyes. "The park sounds perfect," she said, her smile genuine and warm. "But first, coffee and breakfast. The girls have been asking all week when JJ was coming back." The morning routine had become as natural as breathing. Jay helped set the table while Jody prepared plates for the pastries, the twins chattering about everything and nothing as they climbed into their booster seats. The conversation flowed easily now, no longer stilted by the awkwardness of his unexpected presence in their lives. "How did your interview go on Friday?" Jay asked as he poured coffee into Jody's favorite mug, the chipped one with "World's Greatest Mom" that she refused to replace, despite his subtle offers to buy her a new set. "Really well, actually," Jody replied, and Jay didn't miss the note of surprise in her voice. "They offered me the position. Marketing coordinator for a nonprofit that helps single mothers find stable employment. The irony isn't lost on me." Jay felt a surge of pride that he carefully kept from his expression. The nonprofit was one of 3 organizations he'd quietly donated to after learning about Jody's interview, ensuring they'd have the budget to offer competitive salaries to their new hires. "That's wonderful," he said, meaning every word. "You'll be helping people who understand exactly what you've been through." "The salary is good too," Jody continued, her voice carrying a note of disbelief. "Better than what I was making at McCrary Industries, actually. I keep waiting for someone to tell me it's a mistake." It wasn't a mistake. Jay had made sure of that, but he couldn't tell her without revealing the extent of his involvement in her life. Instead, he reached across the small table and covered her hand with his. "You deserve this, Jody. You deserve recognition for your strength and your skills. Any employer would be lucky to have you." The contact sent electricity shooting up both their arms, and for a moment the air between them seemed to shimmer with possibility. Jody's eyes widened slightly, her cheeks flushing pink, and Jay realized that somewhere between the pastry mornings and the bedtime stories, his feelings had shifted from guilt to something infinitely more complex and dangerous. "Can we go to the park now?" Monica interrupted, oblivious to the charged moment between the adults. "I want to show JJ how high I can swing." The neighborhood park was a 15-minute walk through tree-lined streets where children played hopscotch and elderly couples tended gardens. Jay carried both twins on his shoulders, their giggles drawing smiles from neighbors who'd grown accustomed to seeing the businessman who'd become part of the Allen family's weekend routine. "Higher, JJ, higher," Monica called from the swing as Jay gave her gentle pushes. "Be careful, sweetheart," Jody called from the bench where she sat with Tina. "I'm always careful with precious cargo," Jay replied, catching Jody's eye and holding her gaze long enough to see her breath catch. The morning passed in a blur of playground adventures. Jay found himself crawling through tunnel slides, helping steady small hands on monkey bars, and lifting both twins onto his shoulders for games of airplane that left them all breathless with laughter. But it was the quiet moments that affected him most, sitting beside Jody on the bench while the twins explored the sandbox, their shoulders touching just enough to send warmth spreading through his chest. Watching her braid dandelion flowers into Monica's hair while humming a tune he'd never heard, but somehow felt belonged in his soul. "You're good with them," Jody said during one of these stolen moments, her voice barely audible above the sound of children playing. "They adore you." "The feeling is mutual," Jay replied, watching Monica attempt to teach Tina how to perform a cartwheel. "I never realized how much I was missing until I met them. Until I met you." The honesty of the statement surprised them both. Jody turned to study his profile, noting the way the afternoon sun brought out gold flecks in his gray eyes, the relaxed set of his shoulders that she never saw during their early encounters at the office. "What happened to you?" she asked quietly. "To make you so determined to keep everyone at a distance?" Jay was quiet for so long that Jody wondered if she'd overstepped some invisible boundary. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old wounds. "My father," he said simply. "He built McCrary Industries from nothing, and he believed that success required sacrifice, that emotional attachments were weaknesses that would destroy everything he'd worked for. I spent my childhood trying to earn his approval and my adulthood trying to prove he was right. And now?" Jay looked at the twins who had abandoned their cartwheel attempts in favor of building an elaborate sandcastle. "Now I think maybe he was wrong about what's worth sacrificing for." They settled into comfortable silence, watching the twins, and Jay was startled to realize he'd started thinking of Tina and Monica as partly his, create magic from sand and imagination. The autumn air was perfect, warm enough for comfortable sitting, but cool enough to hint at the changing season. "JJ," Tina called from the sandbox, her voice carrying that particular note children used when they were about to make an important announcement. "We made you a castle. Come see." The castle was an architectural marvel by 3-year-old standards, a sprawling complex of towers and walls, decorated with leaves and flowers, and what appeared to be several small stones arranged in patterns only the builders understood. "This is incredible," Jay said, crouching down to examine their work with the seriousness it deserved. "Is this where the Cookie Princess lives?" "No, silly," Monica giggled. "This is where you live. The Cookie Princess lives in the Cloud Castle, remember? This is JJ's castle." "My castle?" Jay looked between the twins and their creation, something warm and unfamiliar blooming in his chest. "You built this for me?" "Uh-huh," Tina nodded solemnly. "Because you're part of our family now, and families build castles for each other." The casual declaration hit Jay like a physical blow. Part of their family. When had that happened? When had he stopped being a visitor and become something more essential? And why did the idea of belonging to this small, perfect unit feel more valuable than everything he'd ever achieved in his professional life? "That's the most beautiful castle anyone's ever built for me," he said, his voice slightly rough with emotion. "Thank you." The afternoon stretched into golden hour, that magical time when everything seemed touched by fairy dust and possibility. They moved from the playground to the small pond where ducks paddled in lazy circles, Jay buying bags of breadcrumbs from a vendor so the twins could feed them properly. "Don't throw it all at once," Jody instructed Monica, who was vibrating with excitement at the prospect of duck interaction. "Just a little bit at a time so they don't get too full." Jay watched Jody guide their daughters through the fine art of duck feeding, her patience infinite and her joy in their wonder absolute. She caught him staring and smiled, that radiant expression that seemed to light up everything around her. "What?" she asked, self-consciously tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "You're beautiful," Jay said simply, the words escaping before he could stop them. "The way you love them, the way you see magic in everything. You're the most beautiful person I've ever met." Jody's cheeks flushed pink, and she looked away as if the intensity of his gaze was too much. J. "I know," he said quickly. "I know this is complicated. I know I'm the man who fired you, who made your life harder when it was already impossible. But Jody, Look," Tina's excited voice interrupted whatever confession Jay had been about to make. "The ducks are dancing." Sure enough, 2 mallards were performing what appeared to be an elaborate courtship ritual, circling each other with graceful neck movements and soft quacking sounds. The twins were enchanted, clapping their hands and giggling at the display. "They're in love," Monica announced with the certainty of someone who understood the most important things about the world. "Like in Mama's stories about the princess and the prince." Jay met Jody's eyes over the twins' heads, and in that moment, surrounded by dancing ducks and laughing children, he saw his future reflected in her warm brown gaze. It was a future that looked nothing like the cold success he'd always pursued, but it was more beautiful than anything he'd ever imagined. As they walked home in the gathering dusk, the twins tired and happy between them, Jay realized that somewhere in the space between pastry mornings and playground adventures, he'd fallen completely, irrevocably in love. Not just with Jody, but with all of them, with the life they'd built together, with the family they were becoming. The question now was whether he had the courage to risk everything he'd built for the chance at something infinitely more valuable. But as Monica slipped her small hand into his and Tina leaned against his side, Jay began to think that maybe some risks were worth taking. Maybe love was the only success that truly mattered. Chapter 7. Dancing in the Rain. Sometimes the most perfect moments arrive disguised as disasters, and sometimes the storm that soaks you to the bone is exactly what you need to wash away everything that doesn't matter. The weather forecast had promised a beautiful Saturday, perfect for the extended park adventure Jay had planned. He'd prepared an elaborate picnic, gourmet sandwiches, fresh fruit, homemade cookies he'd attempted to bake himself, and sparkling cider in a proper wicker basket. "JJ's here." Monica's voice carried through Jody's apartment the moment his knock sounded, followed by small feet racing across hardwood floors. When Jody opened the door, Jay felt his breath catch in his throat, the way it did every time he saw her. 6 weeks of regular meals and reduced stress had brought out a glow in her skin and lightness in her step that made her look like she was lit from within. Today she wore a simple white sundress with tiny blue flowers, her hair loose around her shoulders and her smile bright enough to rival the sun. "Someone's excited," she said, laughing as both twins attached themselves to Jay's legs like small, enthusiastic barnacles. "We're going on a big adventure," Tina announced, her usual shyness forgotten in her excitement. "Mama said we can play in the big park with the tall slides. And feed the ducks," Monica added, "and have a picnic like in the movies." Jay's heart did something complicated and wonderful as he looked down at their upturned faces. Somewhere in the past month and a half, these little girls had become the brightest part of his week. Their unconditional affection healing parts of him he hadn't even realized were broken. "That's right," he said, hefting the picnic basket higher on his arm. "We're going to have the best adventure ever. But first, I need to see if your mama is ready to come play with us." "I'm ready," Jody said, but Jay caught the slight uncertainty in her voice. This was their first real outing beyond the neighborhood park, their first time venturing into what felt like proper date territory, even with the twins as enthusiastic chaperones. The city's main park was a 20-minute drive across town, a sprawling green space with multiple playgrounds, walking trails, and a large pond where families often brought children to feed ducks and swans. Jay had chosen it specifically because it offered enough variety to keep the twins entertained for hours, but also because it had secluded picnic areas where he might find the courage to tell Jody how he felt about her. "Look at all the flowers," Monica squealed as they walked through the park's entrance, her hand firmly clasped in Jay's, while Tina held her mother's hand on the other side. The park was in full autumn glory, maple trees painted in shades of gold and scarlet, flower beds still blooming with late-season chrysanthemums, and the kind of crisp air that made everything feel more vivid and alive. Other families were scattered across the green spaces, children running and playing while parents spread blankets and unpacked elaborate weekend feasts. "Where should we set up our picnic?" Jay asked, surveying the available spots with the strategic eye he usually reserved for business decisions. "There." Tina pointed toward a cluster of oak trees near the pond, where the shade would provide relief from the unexpectedly warm afternoon sun. Under the pretty trees, they spread the checkered blanket Jay had purchased specifically for this occasion, the twins immediately claiming corners and beginning to arrange their collection of small toys around the perimeter. Jay began unpacking the picnic with the careful attention of someone who wanted everything to be perfect, while Jody helped the girls settle in for their outdoor feast. "You really went all out," Jody said softly, watching him arrange gourmet sandwiches on actual plates instead of paper ones. "This is incredible, Jay." "I wanted it to be special," he replied, meeting her eyes with an intensity that made her cheeks flush pink. "You all deserve special." The picnic was a masterpiece of controlled chaos. The twins delighted in every part of the meal, from the fancy sandwiches to the sparkling cider that they were allowed to drink from real glasses, because this is a grown-up picnic. Jay found himself relaxing in ways he'd forgotten were possible, lying on his back on the blanket, while Monica used his chest as a table for her apple slices, and Tina braided grass into elaborate patterns beside his head. "You're different here," Jody observed, settling beside him on the blanket with her own glass of cider. "More yourself, I think." "This is myself," Jay said, surprised by the truth of it. "I just forgot for a while. The man in the office, the one who fired you, That was someone I thought I had to be. But this, he gestured around them, encompassing the park, the picnic, the twins' laughter. This feels like who I actually am. I like who you actually are, Jody said quietly, her fingers toying with the edge of the blanket. The girls adore you, you know. They talk about you all week. JJ this and JJ that. I think they've decided you're permanent. Is that what they've decided? Jay asked, turning on his side to face her properly. What have you decided? Before Jody could answer, Monica spotted the playground equipment in the distance and let out a squeal of delight. Swings! The big swings! Can we go play, Mama? Please. The moment was broken, but not unpleasantly. They packed up the picnic supplies and migrated toward the playground, where the twins immediately began an elaborate exploration of every slide, swing, and climbing structure. Jay found himself following them around like a devoted bodyguard, catching Tina at the bottom of slides and pushing Monica on swings that were taller than anything in their neighborhood park. It was while he was helping Monica navigate the monkey bars that Jay noticed the change in the sky. What had been a perfectly clear afternoon was rapidly filling with dark clouds that seemed to have appeared from nowhere. She looked up at the sky and frowned. That came out of nowhere. Maybe we should... The first drops of rain began to fall just as she spoke, fat droplets that splattered on the playground equipment and sent other families scurrying for their cars with shrieks of surprise. "Rain!" Monica called from the monkey bars, her voice filled with delight rather than concern. "It's raining." "Come on, girls," Jody called, moving toward the playground with clear intent to collect her daughters and head for shelter. "We need to get to the car before this gets worse." But the twins had different ideas. Instead of running for cover, Tina and Monica looked at each other with the kind of wordless communication that only twins possessed. And then they began to laugh. Not the careful, polite laughter of children who were trying to be good, but the wild, joyous laughter of little people who had just realized that rain was not a thing to be feared, but a thing to be celebrated. "Dance with the rain," Monica called, spinning in circles with her arms outstretched as the drops began to fall more steadily. "Dance with the rain," Tina echoed, abandoning her slide conquest to join her sister in an impromptu celebration of the unexpected downpour. "Girls, come on," Jody said, but her voice lacked conviction. She was smiling despite herself, watching her daughters embrace the storm with the kind of fearless joy that adults spent their whole lives trying to recapture. The rain was falling in earnest now, turning from scattered drops to a steady shower that sent the last families running for cover. The park was emptying rapidly, leaving only the four of them standing in the increasingly heavy downpour. "Mama, dance with us," Monica called, her hair already plastered to her head and her dress soaked through. "The rain wants to dance." Jay watched Jody's internal debate play out across her face, the responsible adult who knew they should seek shelter, warring with the woman who had learned to find magic in unlikely places, the woman who whispered to flowers and sang lullabies to chase away nightmares. And then, as if making a decision that would change everything, Jody stepped into the rain. She moved slowly at first, self-consciously, her hands outstretched to catch the droplets that were rapidly soaking through her sundress. But as the twins cheered and reached for her hands, something shifted in her expression. The careful control she maintained dissolved, replaced by something wild and beautiful and completely free. "Come on, JJ," Tina called, her voice barely audible above the sound of rain on playground equipment. "Dance with us." Jay stood at the edge of the covered picnic area, watching the three most important people in his world spinning and laughing in the rain, and felt something fundamental shift inside his chest. This was the moment, he realized. This was the choice between the man he'd been and the man he wanted to become. He stepped into the storm. The rain was warm despite the cool air, soaking through his expensive shirt and perfectly styled hair within seconds. But as Monica grabbed one hand and Tina grabbed the other, as Jody's laugh rang out pure and joyous across the empty park, Jay discovered that being soaked to the bone had never felt so much like flying. They danced in a circle, the four of them, spinning and stumbling and laughing until their sides ached. The twins sang made-up songs about rain fairies and dancing puddles, their voices high and sweet above the sound of the downpour. Jay lifted them one at a time, spinning them through the air while they shrieked with delight, and Jody clapped her encouragement. And then, as if choreographed by some divine intervention, the twins released their hands and ran toward a particularly large puddle they'd spotted near the swings, leaving Jay and Jody alone in the center of their makeshift dance floor. The rain had slowed to a gentle shower, but they were both completely soaked, hair dripping and clothes clinging and makeup, in Jody's case, completely washed away. She looked absolutely beautiful, Jay thought. More beautiful than she'd ever looked in any carefully composed moment, because this was Jody completely unguarded, completely free, completely herself. "Hi," she said softly, suddenly aware that they were standing very close together in the middle of an empty park, their children's laughter providing a soundtrack to what felt like the most important moment of her life. "Hi," Jay replied, his voice rough with emotion. His hands found her waist without conscious decision, settling there as naturally as if they'd done this dance 1,000 times before. "I must look terrible," Jody said, self-consciously pushing wet hair away from her face. "You look perfect," Jay said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. "You look absolutely perfect." They began to move together, not really dancing but swaying to the rhythm of the rain and their own heartbeats. Jody's hands came up to rest on Jay's chest, and she could feel his heart hammering beneath her palms. "Jay," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I know," he said, understanding what she couldn't say. "I know this is complicated. I know I'm the last person who should be here with you. But Jody, I love you," she said suddenly, the words escaping before she could stop them. "I love you, and I don't know when it happened or how it happened, but I do. I love the way you are with the girls, and I love the way you make me feel like I'm worth something more than just surviving. And I'm terrified because I can't afford to be wrong about this." Jay's response was to cup her face in his hands and kiss her, soft and sweet and desperate in the warm rain. It was their first kiss, but it felt like coming home after a lifetime of wandering. Jody melted into him, her arms winding around his neck, and for a moment the rest of the world disappeared entirely. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Jay rested his forehead against hers. "I love you too," he whispered. "I love you so much it scares me. I love the way you sing to flowers and the way you make our girls feel safe, and the way you've taught me that there are things more valuable than money or power or success." "Our girls?" Jody asked, her voice soft with wonder. "If you'll have me," Jay said. "If you'll let me be part of this family you've built. I want to love you and protect you and build something beautiful with you for the rest of my life." Their second kiss was interrupted by twin squeals of delight. "Mama and JJ are kissing," Monica announced to the empty park with the enthusiasm of someone making a groundbreaking discovery. "Like the princess and the prince," Tina added, clapping her hands together. Jay and Jody broke apart, laughing despite their embarrassment. The twins were standing in their puddle, soaked and muddy, and grinning with absolute delight at this development in their favorite fairy tale. "Come here, you two," Jody called, opening her arms to gather her daughters into the embrace. They stood there in the rain, the four of them, holding each other close as the storm passed overhead and left the world washed clean and new. Jay had never imagined that happiness could feel like this, messy and chaotic and absolutely perfect. As they finally made their way back to the car, all of them soaked and shivering but glowing with joy, Jay realized that this was the moment his real life had begun. Everything before this, the empire building, the ruthless pursuit of success, the careful control of every emotion, had been preparation for this single, perfect, rain-soaked afternoon when he'd learned to dance. The storm had passed, but the magic it had brought would last forever. Chapter 8. The Truth in Whispered Confessions. Truth, Jay McCrary discovered, was both the heaviest burden and the greatest freedom a man could carry. And tonight, as he sat in Jody's small kitchen, watching her make tea with trembling hands, he knew the time for carrying burdens alone had finally ended. 2 weeks had passed since the rain-soaked afternoon that changed everything. 2 weeks of stolen kisses and whispered endearments. 2 weeks of learning to love while navigating the complexities of instant family. The twins had embraced their mama's new relationship with enthusiastic approval, understanding that Jay's presence meant more laughter, better bedtime stories, and endless piggyback rides. But Jay carried a secret that grew heavier with each passing day, each moment of happiness built on hidden truths. Every time Jody marveled at her good fortune, the anonymous gifts that had sustained them through the worst times, the job opportunity that had appeared just when she needed it most, Jay felt the weight of his deception like a stone in his chest. Tonight, after tucking the twins into bed with their favorite story about brave princesses and magical gardens, Jay had lingered instead of returning to his penthouse. Something in Jody's expression told him she sensed his restlessness, the way he'd been struggling to meet her eyes. "You're different tonight," Jody said softly, setting a steaming mug of chamomile tea in front of him. "Distant. Have I done something wrong?" The concern in her voice nearly broke his resolve. How could he tell this woman, this incredible, strong, beautiful woman who'd learned to trust him with her heart and her children, that their entire relationship was built on a lie? That he'd been manipulating her life from the shadows for months, playing God with her happiness while pretending to be nothing more than a reformed CEO who'd fallen in love with her strength? "You haven't done anything wrong," Jay said, his voice rough with emotion. "You're perfect, Jody. You and the girls. You're everything I never knew I wanted. That's why I have to tell you the truth." Jody's hand stilled on her mug, and Jay saw fear flicker across her features. "The truth about what?" Jay stood abruptly, pacing to the small window that overlooked the building's garden. The same garden where he'd first seen her with the twins, where he'd watched her create magic from nothing while he nursed his guilt like an open wound. "About everything," he said, his reflection ghost-like in the window glass. "About how I found you, about the gifts, about the job, about all of it. Jay, you're scaring me." Jody's voice was barely a whisper, and when he turned back to face her, he saw her arms wrapped around herself as if she was trying to hold her world together through sheer force of will. "The night I fired you," Jay began, his voice careful and measured, as if he was delivering a business presentation instead of confessing to the woman he loved. "I couldn't stop thinking about what you'd said, about your daughters depending on you, about not having anywhere else to go." He moved back to the table, sitting across from her so she could see his face, so she would know that every word was true. "I felt guilty," he continued. "More than guilty. I felt like I'd just destroyed something precious without understanding what it was. So I followed you home." Jody's eyes widened, but she didn't speak. Jay could see her processing this information, trying to reconcile the man she'd fallen in love with and the stranger who'd apparently been stalking her. "I watched you with Tina and Monica in the garden," Jay said, his voice growing softer with the memory. "I saw how you loved them, how you created joy out of nothing, how you sang to them and made them feel safe, even though your world was falling apart. And I realized I'd made the biggest mistake of my life." "You watched me," Jody repeated, her voice flat. "You followed me home and watched me with my children." "I know how it sounds," Jay said quickly. I know it sounds like I'm some kind of predator or stalker, but it wasn't like that. I was drowning in guilt, Jody. I destroyed your life based on assumptions and prejudices, and I couldn't live with what I'd done. Jody stood abruptly, pacing toward the kitchen as if she needed physical distance to process what he was telling her. So you decided to play God with our lives? Is that what you're saying? The groceries, Jay said, forcing himself to continue despite the horror in her voice. The clothes for the girls, the toys, the money, all of it came from me. I couldn't undo what I'd done, but I thought maybe I could help without you knowing. The silence that followed was deafening. Jay watched Jody's face cycle through emotions, shock, betrayal, hurt, and finally, a cold fury that reminded him uncomfortably of his own expression the morning he'd fired her. The job, she said, her voice dangerously quiet. My interview, the nonprofit that offered me exactly what I needed when I needed it most. That was you too, wasn't it? Jay nodded, unable to trust his voice. How much? Jody asked. How much of my life have you been controlling? How much of our happiness is real, and how much is just another one of your charitable donations? The feelings are real, Jay said desperately, standing and moving toward her. Everything between us, everything with the girls. That's all real, Jody. I can't fake the way Monica falls asleep on my chest during movie nights, or the way Tina asks me to check for monsters under her bed. I can't fake loving you so much that it feels like breathing, but you can fake everything else, apparently. Jody's voice was cold, but Jay could see tears gathering in her eyes. You can manipulate my entire existence and then sit here telling me bedtime stories and kissing me goodnight like you're not secretly pulling all the strings. I stopped, Jay said, desperation creeping into his voice. Months ago, I stopped the anonymous gifts. Once I got to know you, once I realized what I was feeling for you, I couldn't keep lying. But you did keep lying, Jody pointed out, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Every day for months, you've been lying to me. Every time I thanked God for the mysterious benefactor who saved us, every time I marveled at how lucky we'd been, you just sat there and let me believe in fairy tales. Jay felt his world cracking apart, just like Jody's had that terrible morning in the conference room. But unlike that day, he deserved this devastation. He'd earned every bit of the pain in her voice, every tear that was now flowing freely down her cheeks. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, he said quietly. I know I've violated your trust in the worst possible way. But Jody, please believe me when I say that everything I feel for you is real. The man who fell in love with you and the girls, that's who I really am. Not the CEO who fired you, not the manipulator who tried to control your life from the shadows. Is it? Jody asked, her voice breaking. Because I don't know anymore. I don't know what's real and what's just another performance. Did you plan this too? Did you orchestrate falling in love with me as part of some elaborate guilt management strategy? No, Jay said fiercely. That was the one thing I never planned. Loving you, needing you, wanting to build a life with you and the girls, that caught me completely off guard. That's why I had to tell you the truth. Because I can't build something real on a foundation of lies. Jody sank into one of the kitchen chairs, her head in her hands. I trusted you, she whispered. I let you into our lives, into my daughter's hearts. I thought maybe we'd finally caught a break. I thought maybe the universe was trying to make up for David leaving us. The mention of her ex-husband's name hit Jay like a physical blow. Jody, I'm not David. I'm not going to abandon you. I made mistakes, terrible, unforgivable mistakes, but I'm here trying to make them right. Are you? Jody looked up at him with eyes that were red from crying, but blazing with an anger that reminded him why he'd fallen in love with her strength. Or are you just trying to manage the situation, clean up another mess that might affect your reputation? This has nothing to do with my reputation, Jay said, sitting across from her again. This has to do with the fact that I love you so much it terrifies me. This has to do with the fact that for the first time in my life, I found something more important than success or money or power. You and Tina and Monica, you're my whole world now. But we're a world you built, Jody said bitterly. Our stability, our happiness, even our ability to trust in the future. It's all artificial. It's all dependent on your continued charity and manipulation. No, Jay said firmly. You built this world, Jody. You created a home filled with love from nothing but determination and hope. You raised two incredible daughters who see magic everywhere they look. You turned a tiny apartment into a palace of happiness. All I did was remove some of the obstacles that were making it harder for you to survive. Some of the obstacles? Jody's laugh was sharp and bitter. Jay, you were the biggest obstacle. You fired me, remember? You put those obstacles there in the first place. The truth of that statement hit Jay like a sledgehammer. She was right. He'd created the crisis and then appointed himself the savior. He'd destroyed her life and then rebuilt it according to his own vision of what she needed. You're right, he said quietly. I created the problem I was trying to solve. I hurt you and then convinced myself I was helping by trying to fix what I'd broken. But Jody, the feelings are still real. What we have together is based on a lie, Jody interrupted. How am I supposed to trust anything you say now? How am I supposed to know if you really love me, or if you're just trying to assuage your guilt by playing house with the family you destroyed? Jay felt tears burning behind his eyes, tears he hadn't shed since he was a child. Because I'm telling you now, he said desperately, because I'm risking losing everything that matters to me by telling you the truth. If this was just about guilt management, I would have kept my mouth shut and let you go on believing in anonymous benefactors and lucky breaks. But you didn't, Jody pointed out. You told me because the guilt was eating you alive, not because you suddenly developed a conscience about lying to me. She was right again, and Jay knew it. He'd confessed because carrying the secret had become unbearable, not because he'd reached some moral epiphany about honesty in relationships. I need you to leave, Jody said suddenly, her voice steady despite the tears still flowing down her cheeks. I need time to think about all of this. I need to figure out what's real and what's not. Jody, please. The girls are asleep, she said, standing and moving toward the door. I don't want them to wake up and see us like this. I don't want them to know that their world might be falling apart again. Jay stood slowly, his heart breaking with each step toward the door. Can I still see them? I know I don't have any right to ask, but they mean everything to me. I don't know, Jody said honestly. I need to protect them, Jay. They've already lost one father figure. I can't let them get more attached if you're just going to disappear when the guilt finally fades. I'm not going to disappear, Jay said fiercely. Whatever happens between us, I will never abandon those girls. They're my daughters now in every way that matters. Are they? Jody asked, her hand on the doorknob. Or are they just another obligation you've taken on to balance the scales of your conscience? Jay didn't have an answer for that, not one that would satisfy either of them. So he left, walking out into the night with the taste of rain and tears in his mouth, wondering if he'd just lost the only thing that had ever made him truly happy. Behind him, Jody closed the door and slid down it to sit on the floor, finally allowing herself to cry for the fairy tale that had turned out to be just another carefully constructed lie. But in her heart, beneath the anger and betrayal and overwhelming hurt, a small voice whispered that maybe, just maybe, some lies were told out of love rather than malice. And maybe, if she was very brave and very careful, there might still be a way to build something real from the ashes of what they'd lost. The truth was out now, ugly and complicated and painful. But truth, even when it hurt, was still the only foundation solid enough to build a future on. Chapter 9. Shadows from the Past. Some ghosts refuse to stay buried, and some shadows from the past arrive at exactly the moment when you think you've finally found the light. Jay McCrary had been living in purgatory for 2 weeks. 2 weeks since Jody had asked him to leave. 2 weeks since he'd confessed his deception. 2 weeks of sleepless nights and endless days without the sound of Tina and Monica's laughter or the warmth of Jody's smile. He'd thrown himself into work with desperate intensity, but merger documents and quarterly reports felt like meaningless distractions from what truly mattered. Every morning he drove past the diner where Jody had started working again. She turned down the nonprofit position after learning of his involvement, determined to rebuild their lives without any trace of his influence. He watched from across the street as she served coffee and took orders with the same gentle grace she'd always possessed, but he could see the exhaustion in her posture. The twins were thriving, at least outwardly. He saw them during their daily walks to daycare, their small hands clasped in their mother's, while they chattered about their dreams and discoveries. But he noticed that Monica looked over her shoulder more often now, as if searching for a familiar figure who no longer appeared on their route. The sight of that drawing had nearly brought him to his knees, which was why, when his phone buzzed with an unknown number on a gray Tuesday morning, Jay answered with the desperate hope that it might be Jody calling to tell him she was ready to talk. Instead, he heard a voice he didn't recognize, rough, slightly slurred, with the kind of edge that spoke of desperation and poor decisions. "Jay McCrary," the voice said, "you don't know me, but I know you. I know you've been spending time with my wife and daughters." Jay's blood turned to ice water in his veins. "Who is this?" "David Allen," the voice replied, and Jay could hear the smirk in the words. "Jody's husband, Tina and Monica's father. And we need to talk." The meeting was arranged for that afternoon at a small cafe downtown, the kind of place that existed in the gray spaces between respectable establishments and complete dives. Jay arrived early, choosing a corner table where he could observe the entrance while remaining partially concealed himself. He'd contacted his attorney immediately after the phone call, and Detective Martinez from the city police was positioned at a nearby table, posing as a customer while recording equipment captured every word of the conversation that was about to unfold. David Allen arrived 20 minutes late, and Jay's first thought was that this man looked nothing like the devoted husband and father Jody had described in her memories. He was tall but gaunt, with the hollow-eyed look of someone who'd been living rough for months. His clothes were wrinkled and stained, his hair unwashed, and he carried himself with the twitchy energy of someone who was either high or coming down from something. "McCrary," David said, sliding into the seat across from Jay with false confidence. "Thanks for meeting me. Though I gotta say, you're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" Jay asked, his voice carefully neutral while his hands clenched into fists beneath the table. "Someone older, I guess. More desperate looking. But I can see why Jody went for you. All that money and power probably made her feel real secure." David's smile was ugly, predatory. Until now, anyway. "What do you want, Alan?" David leaned back in his chair, studying Jay with the calculating gaze of a con artist sizing up his mark. "I want what's mine. My wife, my daughters, my family. But I'm willing to be reasonable about it." "Your family?" Jay's voice was dangerously quiet. "The family you abandoned 8 months ago? The family you left with nothing but debt and broken promises?" "Temporary separation," David said dismissively. "I had some business to take care of, some debts to settle. But I'm back now and I want my girls. Where have you been?" David's expression flickered with something that might have been shame before hardening again. "That's not your concern. What is your concern is that I'm their legal father and Jody is still my legal wife. I can take them away from here any time I want." Jay felt rage building in his chest like a tide of molten steel, but he forced himself to remain calm. Is that a threat? It's a fact, David replied. But like I said, I'm willing to be reasonable. I know you've got feelings for them, and I know you've got deep pockets. So here's the deal, $50,000 and I disappear forever. I sign whatever papers you want, give up all my parental rights, let you play daddy to my kids without any interference. $50,000, Jay repeated, his voice flat. That's right. Cash, unmarked bills, whatever makes you feel like you're in some kind of movie. In exchange, you get a clear field with Jody and the girls. No messy custody battles, no surprise visits from the real father. Just you and your perfect little ready-made family. Jay studied David's face, noting the slight tremor in his hands, the way his eyes kept darting toward the door, the desperation that leaked through his bravado like water through a cracked dam. What happens if I refuse? Jay asked. David's smile turned cold. Then I exercise my legal rights as a husband and father. I take my family back, and you go back to your empty penthouse and your meaningless business deals. And trust me, McCrary, I may not have your money, but I know how to make people's lives very complicated. You'd hurt them, Jay said, not asking but stating a fact. You'd hurt Jody and the twins just to get money from me. I do what I have to do, David replied. Those girls are my daughters, and Jody is my wife. If she's moved on with some rich boy toy, well, that's something we'll have to work through together. As a family. The threat was clear, and Jay felt something cold and deadly settle in his chest. This man, this pathetic excuse for a human being, was threatening the safety and happiness of the three people Jay loved more than his own life. I need time to think about it, Jay said carefully. 24 hours, David said, standing abruptly. I'll call you tomorrow with instructions for the drop. And McCrary, don't even think about involving the police or trying to be clever. I've got nothing left to lose, which makes me very dangerous to the people you care about. After David left, Jay remained seated for another 10 minutes, his mind racing with possibilities and contingencies. Detective Martinez approached his table, sliding into the seat David had vacated. We got everything, Martinez said quietly. Clear recording of the extortion attempt, threats against the family, admission of abandonment. But McCrary, we need more than just words. We need him to actually attempt to collect the money before we can make an arrest that will stick. Set it up, Jay said, his voice hard as granite. I'll give him exactly what he's asking for. That evening, Jay called Jody for the first time since their devastating conversation 2 weeks earlier. Her voice was cautious when she answered, but he could hear the underlying relief that he'd finally reached out. Jay, is everything okay? We need to talk, he said. In person. It's about David. The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that Jay wondered if she'd hung up. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. David? What about David? He's back, Jody. And he's dangerous. They met at a coffee shop near Jody's apartment, a neutral location where she felt safe, and Jay could explain the situation without the emotional baggage of their personal history overwhelming the conversation. Jody looked exhausted, Jay noticed. The past 2 weeks had taken their toll on her, just as much as they had on him. He called you? She asked after Jay had explained the encounter, her face pale with shock and fear. He wants money in exchange for disappearing forever, Jay said. $50,000 to sign away his parental rights and leave you alone. Oh, God, Jody whispered, her hands shaking as she lifted her coffee cup. I hoped he was gone for good. I thought maybe he'd gotten himself killed with whatever criminal nonsense he was involved in. Criminal nonsense? Jody's laugh was bitter. You really want to know the truth about my marriage, Jay? David was never the devoted husband I made him out to be. He was involved with some very bad people, drugs and gambling and God knows what else. He'd disappear for days at a time, come home high or drunk, or beaten up by whoever he owed money to. I told myself it was temporary, that he'd get clean and become the father Tina and Monica deserved. But he didn't. He got worse. And when the twins were born, when I needed him most, he was either gone completely, or so messed up he was more of a danger than a help. The morning he left for good, I found out he'd emptied our savings account to pay gambling debts. Every penny we'd saved for the girl's future, gone. Jay felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. That's why you never talked about him at work, why you seemed so relieved when I asked about being a single mother. Because I was relieved, Jody admitted. Scared out of my mind about money and the future, but relieved that my daughters wouldn't have to watch their father destroy himself anymore. And now he's back, and he wants to use them as leverage for more money. He's not going to get a penny from me, Jay said fiercely. And he's never going to hurt you or the girls again. I promise you that. How can you promise that? Jody asked, her voice breaking. He's their legal father, Jay. He has rights no matter how terrible he is. And now that he knows about you, knows you have money. Because I'm not going to just give him money and hope he keeps his word, Jay said. I'm going to make sure he can never threaten your family again. The plan was simple in its elegance. Jay would arrange to meet David the following evening in the parking lot of an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city, ostensibly to hand over the $50,000. The location would be surrounded by undercover police officers, and the moment David attempted to collect the money, he'd be arrested for extortion, child abandonment, and whatever other charges Detective Martinez could make stick. What if something goes wrong? Jody asked as Jay explained the details. What if he realizes it's a trap and comes after us? He won't have the chance, Jay said. After tomorrow night, David Allen will be in custody facing serious criminal charges. He'll be looking at years in prison, not plotting revenge against his ex-wife. Ex-wife? I've already spoken with the best family attorney in the state, Jay said. The moment David is arrested, we'll file for emergency divorce proceedings and full custody. His abandonment of the family, combined with the criminal charges, will make it almost impossible for him to claim any parental rights. For the first time since David's name had been mentioned, Jody looked hopeful. You really think this will work? I know it will work, Jay said with quiet confidence. By this time tomorrow, you and the girls will be free of him forever. The next evening arrived gray and cold, with the kind of persistent drizzle that made everything feel ominous and uncertain. Jay sat in his car in the warehouse parking lot, a briefcase containing fake money positioned on the passenger seat, while police officers remained hidden in the shadows around the perimeter. David arrived exactly on time, his movements jittery and paranoid as he approached Jay's car. Through the wire he wore, Jay could hear Detective Martinez's voice providing calm instructions and reassurance. Stay cool, McCrary. Let him make the first move toward the money, and we'll have him. David tapped on the passenger window, and Jay rolled it down with calculated reluctance. You got it? David asked, his eyes fixed on the briefcase. 50,000 just like you asked, Jay replied. But first, I want to see the papers. Proof that you'll sign away your rights to Jody and the girls. David pulled a crumpled document from his jacket, clearly something he'd printed off the internet and filled out by hand. Right here, sign this, get my money and you never see me again. And if I don't, David's expression turned ugly. Then I go collect my wife and daughters tonight. I tell them all about how their new boyfriend tried to buy them like property. I make their lives hell until you decide to pay up. You bastard, Jay said, letting genuine anger color his voice. They're children, David. Your children. They're my ticket to easy money, David replied. Now hand over the briefcase. The moment David's hand touched the handle of the briefcase, The parking lot exploded with movement. Police officers emerged from their hiding places, weapons drawn, surrounding David before he could react. "David Allen, you're under arrest for extortion, child abandonment, and threatening the welfare of minors," Detective Martinez announced as officers cuffed David's hands behind his back. The look of shock and rage on David's face was almost satisfying, but Jay felt no triumph, only relief that this nightmare was finally over. As they loaded David into the back of a police car, he screamed threats and curses that would haunt Jay's dreams for weeks to come. But they were empty threats now, the desperate raging of a man who'd finally run out of people to hurt and scams to run. 3 hours later, Jay sat in Jody's kitchen while she put the twins to bed, knowing that for the first time in 8 months, they were truly safe. The shadow of David Allen had been lifted from their lives forever, and tomorrow they could begin the process of building something real and honest and beautiful. "I brought all your favorites," Jay had said, his voice thick with emotion as he held her close. "And I'm not going anywhere again. Not unless your mama tells me to." "Mama won't tell you to go away," Tina had said with the certainty of someone who understood the most important truths about the world. "She loves you. She told the angels in her prayers." Now, on a crisp autumn evening when the air held the first hint of winter's approach, Jay stood in his penthouse apartment, making the final preparations for what he hoped would be the most important evening of his life. The plan had taken weeks to orchestrate, and unlike his previous attempts to manage Jody's happiness from the shadows, this plan had been developed with her full knowledge and enthusiastic participation. Margaret had been dispatched with the twins earlier that afternoon, taking them for what she'd described as a special girls' adventure that included mani-pedis at a child-friendly salon, shopping for the perfect princess dresses, and dinner at their favorite restaurant. It was a mission she'd embraced with the devotion of someone who'd watched her usually cold-hearted boss transform into a man capable of joy. "Mr. McCrary," she'd said as he'd handed her his credit card and a detailed itinerary, "I've worked for you for 8 years, and I've never seen you this happy. Those girls and their mother, they're the best thing that ever happened to you." "I know," Jay had replied, adjusting his tie for the 12th time, "which is why tonight has to be perfect." The apartment had been transformed into something from a fairy tale. Professional lighting designers had strung thousands of tiny white lights across the ceiling, creating the illusion of a starlit sky. Rose petals had been scattered across the floor in patterns that led from the entrance to the center of the living room, where a circle of candles waited to be lit. Soft jazz music played from hidden speakers, the same Duke Ellington album that had been playing the night they danced in Jody's tiny kitchen. The ring sat in its velvet box on the coffee table, a brilliant solitaire diamond surrounded by smaller stones that sparkled like captured starlight. Jay had spent hours with the jeweler, describing Jody's style, her preferences, the way her eyes lit up when she saw something beautiful but practical. At exactly 7 o'clock, the elevator chimed, and Jay's heart began hammering against his ribs with the force of a man about to jump from a perfectly functional airplane. The doors opened to reveal Jody, and Jay felt his breath catch in his throat the way it did every time he saw her. She wore a simple black dress that hugged her curves in all the right places, her hair falling in soft waves around her shoulders, and her makeup subtle but perfect. But it was her expression that nearly brought him to his knees. Wonder, joy, and a love so pure and bright that it seemed to illuminate everything around her. "Jay," she breathed, stepping into the transformed apartment. Oh my God, this is incredible." "You deserve incredible," Jay said, moving to take her hands. "You deserve magic and beauty and all the fairy tales you've taught your daughters to believe in." Before Jody could respond, the elevator chimed again, and two small voices filled the apartment with excitement. "Mama! "Mama, look at us!" Monica called as she and Tina emerged from the elevator, resplendent in matching princess dresses. Monica's a brilliant blue that matched her eyes. Tina's a soft pink that brought out the roses in her cheeks. "My beautiful girls," Jody said, kneeling to embrace them both. "You look absolutely gorgeous." "Margaret helped us pick them out," Tina said proudly. "And she taught us about the special job we have tonight." "Special job?" Jody asked, looking between her daughters and Jay with growing understanding. "We get to throw flower petals," Monica announced, producing a small silk bag from behind her back. "And we get to make sure Mama says yes when JJ asks his important question." Jay felt his heart swell with love for these two little girls who'd accepted him into their lives with such generosity and grace. Over the past few months, they'd become more than just the children of the woman he loved. They'd become his daughters in every way that mattered, and he couldn't imagine a future that didn't include their laughter and wonder and unconditional affection. "Are you ready for this?" Jay asked Jody quietly as the twins positioned themselves around the room with the seriousness of professional wedding coordinators. "I've been ready since the day you showed up at my door with sunflowers," Jody replied, her eyes bright with unshed tears of joy. Jay moved to the center of the room, his hands trembling slightly as he reached into his jacket pocket. The twins had taken their positions as instructed, Monica near the windows and Tina by the kitchen, both clutching their bags of rose petals with barely contained excitement. "Jody Allen," Jay began, his voice carrying across the candlelit space with absolute certainty. "3 months ago, I was a man who measured success by the height of his office and the coldness of his heart. I thought I had everything I needed, everything that mattered." He dropped to one knee in the center of the fairy light constellation, pulling the ring box from his pocket as the twins began scattering rose petals in the air with delighted giggles. "But you taught me that I had nothing," Jay continued, his eyes never leaving Jody's face. "You taught me the difference between building an empire and building a home. You showed me what it means to love someone so completely that their happiness becomes more important than your own survival." Tears were flowing freely down Jody's cheeks now, but she was smiling with the kind of radiant joy that seemed to fill the entire apartment with warmth. "You and Tina and Monica saved me," Jay said, opening the ring box to reveal the diamond that caught the fairy lights and threw them back in brilliant sparkles. "You saved me from a life of emptiness and showed me what it means to be part of a family. You taught me that some fairy tales are real, and that the best ones begin not with once upon a time, but with from this day forward." "Jay," Jody whispered, her hands pressed to her heart. "I love you," Jay said, his voice breaking with emotion. "I love your strength and your kindness and the way you find magic in the most ordinary moments. I love the way you sing to flowers and dance in the rain and make our daughters feel like the most precious treasures in the universe. I love the woman you are, and I love the family we've become together." He held up the ring, its facets catching the light from thousands of fairy bulbs above them. "Jody Allen, will you marry me? Will you let me spend the rest of my life loving you and Tina and Monica? Will you help me build something beautiful and real and lasting from everything we've learned about trust and forgiveness and the courage it takes to choose love over fear?" "Yes," Jody said, her voice ringing clear and strong across the candlelit space. "Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes." The twins erupted in cheers, throwing their remaining flower petals high into the air as Jay slipped the ring onto Jody's finger and rose to kiss her with all the passion and promise and overwhelming gratitude that filled his heart to bursting. "We're really getting married?" Monica asked, bouncing on her toes with excitement. "We're really becoming a family," Jay confirmed, lifting her into his arms while Tina attached herself to his leg with typical enthusiasm. "Can we call you Daddy Jay now?" Tina asked, her voice soft with hope and wonder. Jay's answer was lost in the emotion that threatened to overwhelm him entirely. He knelt down to gather both girls into his arms, holding them close as Jody joined their group embrace. "You can call me whatever feels right to you," he said finally. "But I hope you know that whether you call me JJ or Daddy J or just Dad, I will love you both for the rest of my life. I will protect you and support you and be there for every scraped knee and bad dream and important milestone from now until forever." "Forever and ever?" Monica asked with the seriousness of someone negotiating the most important contract of her young life. "Forever and ever," Jay promised. As they stood together in the center of their fairy tale apartment, surrounded by candlelight and flower petals and the promise of all the tomorrows they would share, Jay realized that this was what success really looked like. Not the cold achievements of his corporate empire, but the warm chaos of family life. Not the isolation of power, but the beautiful mess of toys and laughter and bedtime stories and Sunday morning pancakes. "I love you, Mrs. McCrary-to-be," Jay whispered against Jody's ear as the twins began planning their wedding with elaborate enthusiasm. "I love you too, Mr. Soon-to-be Daddy," Jody replied, her ring catching the light as she traced the line of his jaw with gentle fingers. Outside the windows, the city stretched away in all directions, full of other people living other lives and pursuing other dreams. But inside their circle of light and love and promise, Jay and Jody and Tina and Monica had found something more valuable than all the wealth and power in the world. They had found each other, and they had found home, and they had learned that the very best fairy tales were the ones you wrote yourself, one day at a time, with love and patience and the courage to believe that happily ever after was not just possible, but inevitable for those brave enough to reach for it. The woman who whispered to flowers had taught the powerful CEO how to listen, and together they had created a love story worthy of all the dreams they would pass on to their daughters. A story that began with heartbreak and grew into joy, that started with deception and blossomed into truth, that transformed a broken family into something whole and beautiful and eternal. And as the fairy lights twinkled overhead like earthbound stars, as the twins giggled and planned and filled the apartment with boundless joy, as Jody's ring caught the light and threw it back in brilliant promises, Jay knew that this was only the beginning of their greatest adventure yet.